There is room for Indigenous culture in modern Australia.
We strongly believe that the Australian Indigenous culture is significant to contemporary Australian society. Not only are Australians becoming more knowledgeable about other cultures, including the Indigenous Australians, but Australia as a whole is a uniquely diverse country that prides itself on the profound array of cultures that call this country home. When we look at how and why the Aboriginal culture belongs in contemporary Australia, we look to our history and how Australia has become the Australia we know today. Although our history is tremendously traumatic for the Indigenous people, we have built a country that strives to welcome and include all people from around the globe. Each and every culture within our country has a place in Australian society to uphold our inclusive values. It's our belief that the Indigenous Australians have a very honoured place in Australian society and to have their culture respectfully embedded into our practices. Not only are the Indigenous Australians the First Nations of this country, but they are the oldest documented living culture in the world. This is a major cause for celebration, considering the impacts the Indigenous people had to endure as a result of the British colonising Australia. The Indigenous Australians are the richest part of Australian history. They're the very beginning, and this is why their culture should be celebrated, learnt, respected and shared among contemporary Australian society.
There is a proven racial bias towards Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders in Australia, especially in the education, health and justice systems. A 2011 Challenging Racism report showed that 27.9% of non-Indigenous Australians showed some sort of racial beliefs when asked if they would be concerned if a family member wanted to marry an Indigenous person. We can reduce this racism by improving knowledge and education on Indigenous culture. If more non-Indigenous Australians are educated on Aboriginal culture, it will reduce racism and bias towards Indigenous Australians. This will further help improve Indigenous Australians' self-identity and help increase a connection in their culture. Specifically, this is important to help improve mental, physical and spiritual health and well-being, which works towards closing the gap. Close the Gap is a campaign that was initiated in 2007, which worked to improving the socioeconomic status of all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. Despite a large amount of non-Indigenous Australians showing racist attitudes, 85.6% believe something needs to be done to combat racism, which includes educating and introducing Indigenous culture to non-Indigenous Australians, which will further help unite Australia as a whole. This is why we believe that Indigenous culture is important to be recognised and educated on within the Australian mainstream society today.
There is so much to learn from Indigenous culture, which can help modern Australians thrive. Firstly, education. Australia's ranking worldwide in education has been dropping by the year. Higher-ranking education systems in the world have implemented the philosophy that education takes place out of the classroom, and therefore have integrated common subjects like math, English and science in a more practical, hands-on approach with topics like physical education, cooking and economics. This is an approach that Aboriginal culture has been educating their children for thousands of years. Another aspect we can learn from Aboriginal culture is how to respect and deal with land and water crisis. Since colonisation, Australia has failed in how to deal with Australia's bushfires, river systems drying up, the Great Barrier Reef dying, and so on. Indigenous culture is embedded in the ideals that the land is life, land is sacred and connects each of us, and therefore have ways of managing bushfires through controlling burning rituals, land and water practices, and simply respecting the land. The final example to involve Aboriginal culture in modern Australian society is the justice system. The Indigenous justice system leans on the community being engaged and involved in the process, with community elders being respected and being valued as leaders. This is all to emphasise how there is more than enough room for Indigenous culture in modern Australian society, and even more so to be learned from.